Ryan McAllister had a dream: to make the front page of every newspaper in Glasgow. But the boy from Govanhill didn't just want fame, he wanted fear, power, and a name that would be whispered in every alley. What started as petty theft soon spiraled into a trail of violence, betrayal, and murder, turning him from a streetwise kid into one of Scotland's most notorious gangsters. Ryan McAllister was born in the rough heart of Glasgow's Govanhill district, a place where narrow streets and grey tenements told stories of hardship. His childhood was marked by noise, the shouting of neighbors, the sirens at night, and the distant hum of trains leaving for better places. Ryan's father was a petty thief who drifted in and out of prison, while his mother struggled to raise 3 children on a cleaner's wages. Their tiny flat was always cold, the wallpaper peeling and the fridge half empty. From a young age, Ryan learned that survival in Govanhill meant toughness, not kindness. At school, Ryan was the boy teachers gave up on. He was restless, easily angered, and drawn to trouble. The streets offered him what the classroom never could: a sense of power. He admired the older boys who stood on corners with gold chains, leather jackets, and pockets full of cash. They were local legends, feared by some and respected by others. Ryan watched them closely, studying the way they walked and the way people moved aside when they passed. In his eyes, these men had everything: money, style, and attention, and that attention was what he wanted most. By the time he was 13, Ryan was running errands for small-time crooks. He delivered packages, kept lookout during shoplifting sprees, and learned how to spot undercover police. Each small job came with a reward: a few pounds, a warm meal, or a pat on the back from men who called him a clever lad. That praise meant more to him than anything else. It was his ticket into a world that made him feel important. The more he got involved, the more invisible rules of the street became clear. Loyalty mattered, fear worked better than respect, and violence was just another language. His mother tried to keep him away from trouble, begging him to stay home at night. But Ryan had already made up his mind. He wanted to escape the life of poverty he was born into, and crime seemed like the only way out. The police knew his name before he was 16. His first arrest came after a botched attempt to steal a motorbike. Instead of fear, the arrest filled him with pride. In his mind, it proved that he was someone worth noticing. The local boys started calling him Rhino, a nickname that stuck and made him feel like part of something bigger. After that, there was no turning back. Ryan began skipping school completely and spending his days at the pool hall, planning petty thefts and bragging about fights he hadn't won. The older gang members started to take him seriously. He was quick, daring, and always eager to prove himself. When he looked in the mirror, he no longer saw the poor boy from Govanhill. He saw a future gangster. What he didn't see was the darkness already forming behind his ambition. Every crime, every reckless act, and every lie to his mother was shaping him into something dangerous. He didn't know it yet, but his hunger for attention would soon turn him into one of Glasgow's most feared names. By his early 20s, Ryan McAllister had transformed from a restless street kid into a hardened criminal. The small-time jobs that once gave him excitement no longer satisfied him. He wanted real money, real recognition, and a crew that could put him at the center of Glasgow's underworld. That opportunity came when he met members of the Black Hill Boys, a gang that controlled much of the city's East End through intimidation, stolen goods, and drugs. They were known for their discipline and brutality, and Ryan's reckless courage caught their attention. His first task was simple: collecting money from a shopkeeper who was late on protection payments. But when the man refused, Ryan didn't hesitate. He smashed the man's window, left a clear warning, and walked away without fear. That single act earned him respect among the crew. Under the wing of senior members, Ryan learned the inner workings of the gang. They dealt in everything from counterfeit electronics to cocaine smuggling. Every night, deals were made in pubs, car parks, and back alleys. Ryan watched and absorbed it all, realizing that street life wasn't just about violence, it was about strategy. He had a natural ability to plan routes, spot weaknesses, and talk his way out of dangerous situations. Soon, he was leading small operations, planning robberies that were quick, silent, and profitable. His name began to spread quietly through the underground world of Glasgow. With money came confidence. Ryan started dressing better. Designer jackets, flashy watches, expensive trainers. He moved out of his mother's flat and into a small apartment near the River Clyde, a place he could call his own. But he didn't stop there. He wanted people to notice him when he walked into a room. He bought a used BMW, customized it, and drove it through the city as if he owned it. The streets he once loitered on as a teenager were now his territory. The young boys who had once looked up to others now looked up to him. But Ryan's ambitions were bigger than the Black Hill Boys' expectations. He didn't just want to make money, he wanted a name. He craved headlines, the kind that turned criminals into legends. The old stories of Glasgow's gangsters, men like Arthur Thompson, fascinated him. He read about their rise to power and how newspapers once feared to print their names. He wanted that kind of fame. He started taking bigger risks, often ignoring orders from the gang's leaders. When told to stay quiet, he acted louder. When told to keep low, he went public. His growing arrogance began to draw attention from both rivals and the police. The Calton Crew, a powerful gang that dominated the city center, saw Ryan as a threat to their control. Meanwhile, detectives began linking his crew to a string of violent robberies. The tension grew, but Ryan didn't care. The fear of consequences had long disappeared. In his mind, every crime, every mention in hushed tones, brought him closer to the spotlight. What no one realized was that Ryan's hunger for recognition would soon push him past the line separating survival from destruction. He was no longer satisfied with being part of Glasgow's criminal world. He wanted to own it, no matter what it cost. As Ryan McAllister's influence within the Black Hill Boys grew, so did his appetite for power. His name was now whispered in back alleys and pool halls across Glasgow. To the younger street kids, he was a symbol of fear and success. A man who had climbed from the gutter to the top of the food chain. But with every new level of fame came more enemies. The city's criminal underworld was divided into territories, and Ryan's ambition was beginning to cross lines that had been drawn long before he arrived. The Calton Crew, one of the oldest and most feared gangs in Glasgow, controlled the city center and much of the lucrative drug trade. Their leader, Danny Kerrigan, had ruled for years through fear and precision. Ryan, however, saw him as an outdated relic of the past, a man he believed he could outsmart and eventually replace. At first the rivalry was subtle. The Black Hill Boys began selling drugs in areas that belonged to the Calton Crew, using fake suppliers and front businesses to disguise their operations. Ryan orchestrated these moves carefully, believing he could take over piece by piece without sparking an all-out war. But Glasgow's streets were alive with gossip, and nothing stayed hidden for long. Within weeks, Kerrigan's men retaliated. 2 of Ryan's dealers were beaten, and 1 safe house was burned to the ground. Instead of backing off, Ryan took it as a challenge. He ordered retaliations of his own, sending masked men to smash up pubs and garages linked to the Calton Crew. The cycle of violence had begun. The city's East End turned tense. Locals who had once tolerated the gangs now lived in fear of stray bullets and firebombs. Cars exploded in the middle of the night, businesses closed early, and police patrols doubled. To Ryan, this chaos was proof of his growing power. Each act of violence, each whisper of his name, made him feel untouchable. His own crew, however, began to worry. The older members warned him that he was pushing too far, too fast. But Ryan refused to listen. He was obsessed with making an impact that no one could ignore. The thought of being just another forgotten gangster haunted him more than the risk of prison or death. Then came the moment that truly defined the rivalry. Ryan arranged a robbery of a money courier that was known to be protected by the Calton Crew. It was supposed to send a message of dominance. The heist was successful, but one of the Calton men was left badly injured. From that day, the war became personal. The Calton Crew declared open hostility, promising revenge. Ryan's name began appearing in criminal reports and police briefings. His photograph was circulated internally, marking him as a person of interest. Instead of being alarmed, Ryan felt proud. For him, danger was proof that he mattered. He had always wanted his name to mean something, and now it did. Yet beneath that pride, cracks were forming. His gang was splitting into factions, and his reckless decisions were creating enemies even within his own ranks. Ryan was too consumed by ego to see the truth. He wasn't just fighting rivals anymore. He was fighting everyone who stood between him and the fame he so desperately craved. And in the streets of Glasgow, that kind of pride always led to blood. The night that changed everything for Ryan McAllister began like any other. February had wrapped Glasgow in a damp chill, and the streets were slick with rain. Ryan sat in the back of a stolen van, his gloved hands tapping impatiently against the cold metal. He had planned this job for weeks, a high-end jewelry shop in the city center that kept its safe stocked with luxury watches and diamonds. The heist wasn't just about the money. Ryan saw it as a statement, a way to show the Calton Crew and the police that he was still one step ahead. He wanted a job so bold that no one could ignore it. In his mind, this was the move that would put his name in the headlines and cement his place as Glasgow's most daring criminal. The plan was simple. The crew would strike after midnight when the city was asleep. They'd break in through the back alley, disable the alarm, and be gone within minutes. Ryan had handpicked his team, men he trusted, or at least thought he could. Everything unfolded perfectly at first. The alarm system was cut, the display cases smashed, and trays of diamonds swept into bags. But as they prepared to leave, a noise broke the silence. A voice calling out from the shadows. A young security guard had come back early from his break, spotting movement inside the shop. For a moment, time froze. The others panicked, shouting for Ryan to run. But Ryan stood still, his mind racing. The guard couldn't have been older than 20. His uniform was too big for him, and his flashlight trembled in his hand. Ryan raised his gun, hoping to scare him, but the guard stepped closer. Maybe he thought he could stop them. Maybe he didn't realize how dangerous the situation was. Ryan's heartbeat thundered in his ears. In that split second, pride and fear collided. If he let the guard go, the boy would call the police, and everything Ryan had built would fall apart. But pulling the trigger meant crossing a line he could never return from. His finger tightened, and a single gunshot shattered the stillness of the night. The guard fell instantly, his flashlight rolling across the floor and casting a ghostly glow over the shattered glass. The rest of the crew bolted, dragging Ryan out with them. They fled into the rain, hearts pounding, the sound of sirens echoing in the distance. Ryan sat in silence the whole ride back, staring at his hands. He told himself it had been necessary, that the guard had left him no choice. But deep inside, something shifted. The excitement he had always felt after a job was gone, replaced by a heavy emptiness he couldn't shake. The next morning, the newspapers were full of it. Tragedy at Glasgow Jewelers, one headline read. The story described the death of a young security guard who had been saving money for university. Ryan's name wasn't mentioned, but he knew the police would soon be looking for him. He finally had what he wanted, the front-page story, the fame, the fear. But instead of pride, he felt only dread. For the first time, the streets of Glasgow didn't feel like home. They felt like a trap closing in. The killer he had become was everything he once dreamed of, and everything he now hated. In the days following the jewelry shop killing, Glasgow was consumed by shock and fear. The news spread rapidly. Television channels ran footage of the crime scene. Police cars filled the streets, and the city's newspapers printed bold headlines about the diamond heist tragedy. For the first time in his life, Ryan McAllister had become part of something bigger than street gossip. His name, though not yet public, was whispered in police briefings, underworld circles, and corner pubs. He had achieved the attention he always wanted, but it came wrapped in death and paranoia. He spent hours glued to the TV, replaying the news clips over and over. Each time the presenter mentioned the unknown gunman, Ryan felt a twisted sense of satisfaction. He had made it to the front page, just as he had dreamed, but the price of that fame was beginning to sink in. The city turned into a hunting ground. Police launched one of the largest manhunts Scotland had seen in years. Roadblocks were set up, cars were searched, and CCTV footage was studied frame by frame. The officers didn't have a name yet, but they had a blurry image. A man in dark clothes fleeing the scene with a gun. Ryan recognized himself instantly when the footage was aired on the news. The sight froze him. It was one thing to commit a crime in the dark, but another to see your own silhouette broadcast across the nation. He threw the remote at the television, shattering the screen, but it didn't stop the feeling that his world was closing in. The Black Hill Boys began to crumble under the pressure. Police raided their hideouts, seized cash, and arrested several members. Those who weren't caught started turning on one another, trying to save themselves by leaking information. Ryan knew it was only a matter of time before someone mentioned his name. His phones were burned, his cars abandoned, and his movements reduced to a few safe routes through the back streets of Glasgow. Despite the danger, he couldn't stop himself from picking up newspapers from local kiosks, pretending to be just another customer. He read every detail, every speculation, with a strange mix of pride and terror. The headlines painted him as a cold-blooded killer, a ghost haunting the city's criminal world. The fame he had once craved now haunted him. He became increasingly paranoid. He stopped sleeping properly, convinced that every sound outside was a police raid or a rival out for revenge. His reflection began to look unfamiliar, his eyes hollow, his face thinner, his confidence replaced by exhaustion. He moved from flat to flat, staying with old aunts who demanded money or silence in exchange for a night's shelter. On one occasion, he returned to his mother's street, watching her flat from a distance, but too afraid to knock. He had become a stranger to the only person who had ever cared for him. Meanwhile, Glasgow's criminal world turned its back on him. The Calton Crew saw his downfall as an opportunity to reclaim their lost ground. Anonymous tips poured into the police, many pointing them closer to Ryan's hiding places. He could feel the walls tightening every day, and for the first time he realized he had no allies left. His rise to infamy had isolated him completely. He had wanted to be remembered as a legend, but instead he was being hunted as a murderer. What had once been ambition was now a nightmare he couldn't escape. The fame that once fed his ego was now the fire burning it to ash. As the weeks dragged on, Ryan McAllister's world shrank into shadows and paranoia. The once bustling streets of Glasgow, where he had walked with swagger and confidence, now seemed alien and hostile. Every face in a shop window, every passing car, every footstep behind him made his heart race. Sleep became a luxury he could no longer afford. He would rest in short bursts, never more than a few hours at a time, always waking with the pounding fear that someone was coming for him. The city he once ruled with bravado had transformed into a maze of traps, and Ryan was trapped in it alone. His hiding places were constantly shifting. One night he would sleep in an abandoned flat above a closed-down grocery store, the next in a damp storage unit at the edge of town. He carried multiple weapons with him at all times, knives, a handgun, and a few makeshift tools. Anything that could protect him. Even his meals became a risk. He avoided supermarkets and restaurants, instead relying on scraps or food left by strangers who owed him favors or feared him. The streets he had once dominated now seemed to whisper threats. Every shadow a potential enemy. Paranoia had become his constant companion, replacing the thrill of criminal life with a grinding anxiety. Trust became impossible. His own crew, the Black Hill Boys, had fractured under pressure. Some had been arrested, others had vanished, fearing they would be next. Those who remained were cautious, often avoiding him entirely. He could no longer rely on old friends or associates, and the few who did approach him did so with hidden agendas, hoping to survive at his expense. Ryan started suspecting even familiar faces of betrayal, convinced that anyone he interacted with might be feeding information to the police or the Calton Crew. Every smile felt false, every handshake a potential trap. Ryan's mind, once sharp and calculating, began to unravel. The constant fear, sleepless nights, and relentless pressure took their toll. He started hearing noises that weren't there, footsteps echoing in empty streets, voices whispering through walls. Shadows seemed to move with intent, and he became convinced that the police or rival gang members were watching him even when he was alone. His thoughts grew erratic, swinging between moments of hyper-focused planning and terrifying hallucinations. The criminal genius who had once orchestrated flawless heists now struggled to remember which routes were safe and which allies could be trusted. Despite the chaos consuming him, Ryan refused to surrender. The thought of going to prison, of letting the police or his rivals claim him, was unbearable. He had already tasted the fame and fear that came with being wanted, and he clung to it like a drug. Every day in hiding was a battle, every shadow a potential attack, and every step a calculated risk. His ambition, which had once driven him forward, now fueled his fear, keeping him constantly on edge. He had wanted to be remembered, to make a name for himself, but the streets had turned his dream into a prison. Ryan's descent into madness marked the final stage of his transformation from ambitious street kid to a man consumed by the consequences of his own choices. The boy who had once craved attention and headlines was now reduced to running, hiding and fearing every movement. He had become a ghost, both hunted and haunted, trapped in a life that no longer offered freedom or power. Every passing hour reinforced the stark reality. The fame he sought had become a relentless curse, and escape from it seemed impossible. Weeks of constant fear and exhaustion had turned Ryan McAllister into a shadow of the man he once was. His movements were precise, almost mechanical, yet always laced with tension. Every alleyway, every doorway, and every empty street was a potential death trap. The police and the Calton Crew had become equally relentless, and the walls of Glasgow seemed to close in from all sides. Ryan knew he couldn't keep running forever. Every day brought new threats, and his energy, once endless, was now consumed by sheer survival. It was just before dawn when the authorities finally located him. The building was an old, crumbling tenement on the outskirts of the city, a place no one would think to check unless they had inside information. Dozens of officers surrounded the structure, their vehicles' sirens off but lights flashing to illuminate the area. Ryan, inside a small, darkened room on the top floor, could see the blue and red reflections bouncing against the walls. He had known this day would come, eventually. Despite months of careful planning and countless hideouts, he had made mistakes, and now the net had closed in. He felt a strange calm settle over him, as if the final act of his life was about to begin. Ryan had armed himself heavily. He had a handgun in each hand, and knives strapped to his body. His eyes, wide and wary, scanned the dim interior for the first sign of movement. Every creak of the floorboards sounded like a warning. He could hear the soft murmurs of officers outside, the low hum of radios, and the distant echo of someone calling his name. The world had narrowed to the room he occupied, and within that small space, he was both predator and prey. Every decision mattered. Every movement could be the difference between life and death. The standoff began quietly. Officers called for him to surrender, their voices firm but measured. Ryan, however, refused. Surrender had never been an option for him. It would mean the end of the persona he had worked so hard to build. Instead, he raised his gun, prepared to fight for every inch of his freedom. The tension in the room was suffocating. Outside, the police moved into position, ready for a breach. Inside, Ryan's mind raced through every possibility. Escape, attack, negotiation, but none seemed viable. The life he had fought to control had come to this single moment, and there was no turning back. When the first officers entered, Ryan fired indiscriminately, bullets striking the walls and ceiling. The sound of gunfire echoed through the building, startling the few residents still awake. But it was short-lived. The sheer number of officers, their strategic positioning, and their overwhelming firepower quickly overpowered him. Minutes later, Ryan lay on the floor, bleeding and exhausted, the adrenaline of fear and fight slowly fading. He had survived, but only just. His eyes, once sharp and full of ambition, now reflected confusion and resignation. The standoff had ended, not with glory but with the grim reality of his choices. In that moment, Ryan McAllister's life came full circle. The boy who had dreamed of headlines and infamy now faced the consequences of every reckless act, every violent choice, and every ambition turned obsession. The streets he had once ruled with audacity had claimed him at last. The world outside would soon hear his story, but not as he had imagined. It would be a story of fear, tragedy, and the relentless cost of chasing fame at any price. Ryan McAllister's story did not end with the final gunshot or his capture that cold morning in Glasgow. His name became a fixture in newspapers, crime reports, and police briefings. But the fame he had sought so desperately came with a bitter irony. People remembered him not for clever heists or daring escapes, but as the boy who had wanted attention more than life itself, the man who had killed to see his name in print, in pubs and on street corners. Older criminals spoke of him with a mixture of awe and warning, recounting the rise and fall of a man consumed by ambition. To the younger generation of street kids, Ryan became a legend, not a model to emulate, but a cautionary tale of how quickly dreams can turn into nightmares. In the months after his arrest, Ryan's trials dominated headlines. Police detailed his crimes, the escalating violence between the Blackhill boys and the Calton Crew, and the tragic death of the young security guard that had set everything into motion. His family faced public scrutiny, forced to confront the reality that their son had become one of Glasgow's most notorious criminals. Even those who had once respected him in the underworld began to distance themselves, wary of the attention he brought. Ryan, who had once thrived on fear and notoriety, now existed as a symbol of ruin. He had everything he wanted: attention, headlines, recognition, but it had come at the cost of freedom, loyalty, and life itself. In prison, Ryan's isolation deepened. Guards noted his silence, his constant pacing, and the haunted look in his eyes. The boy who had craved the spotlight now vanished into a world of gray walls and locked doors. He spent hours replaying every choice that had led him here, wondering if any moment could have been different. He thought about the friends he had lost, the people he had betrayed, and the guard whose life he had ended. Fame, he realized, was fleeting, and attention could never replace the sense of purpose and belonging he had once sought. The headlines that once thrilled him now felt like chains, reminders of a life that had spun out of control. Outside the prison walls, Glasgow began to forget the fear that had once gripped the city. The Calton Crew regained its footing. Other gangs rose and fell, and the news cycle moved on. Ryan's name faded from casual conversation, surviving only in police records and archived articles. Yet in the shadows of the city, his story lingered. Graffiti in alleyways and whispered warnings in pubs kept his memory alive. To some, he was a legend of audacity. To others, a fool who had destroyed everything in pursuit of a fleeting dream. His life became a lesson etched into the psyche of Glasgow's streets. Ambition without restraint can be deadly, and the desire to be remembered can lead to ruin. Ryan McAllister had wanted to make the front page, and in the end, he did. But the front page told a story far different from the one he had imagined. It was a story of obsession, violence, and the relentless consequences of chasing recognition at any cost. His rise and fall became a grim reminder that the streets reward boldness only for a moment, and that fame gained through fear is never truly free. Though his name would fade in time, the shadow of his actions would remain, haunting the city he had once believed he could conquer. In the end, Ryan McAllister became not a legend of power but a cautionary echo of a boy who reached for the spotlight and found only darkness.